Adios.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Anthony. Before trying to answer these difficult questions, let me say welcome to everybody. I think it's the first time of this kind of session that we have so many people in this hall. But thanks a lot for coming. But there's a distinguished South African who's with us today who has not been acknowledged. So I want to acknowledge him. He's become a bit of a superstar. I'm talking about Dr. Mbeki UNISA. Welcome, Chief. Now, with regard to these questions that have been posed, fortunately, with regard to the last group of questions, fortunately, I'm a retiree and therefore cannot really speak about the GNU except as an outside observer. If you look at the government website and you look for what Francois talked about, the medium-term development plan, you won't find it. It's not there. I say that because I looked for it. Because I really wanted to understand what is it, medium-term development plan, because it's about the issues that it's raising, about reduction of poverty, eradication of poverty, reduction of unemployment, all of these questions. The reason it's not there, I'm told, is that the draft was prepared and then discussed at Cabinet Lekotla, and various suggestions emerged out of that Lekotla. And so it requires amending it, after which it will then be posted on the website, government websites. But fortunately, I've got friends in high places. So they leaked to me the draft. So my comments, therefore, about it are based on the draft, not the complete finalized document. I think all of us in the room here are familiar with the National Development Plan, the NDP. And the basic complaint by everybody, including government, is that very little was done to implement the NDP. And an important part of the reason for that is that the NDP was not a plan. It's not a plan. It's a vision. This is what we would like South Africa to look like by the year 2030. In this element, and this and that and that and the other. But it does not say what is it that you do in order to get there. That's the same problem with the medium-term development plan. It's not a plan. Maybe it's a vision, maybe it's a wish list. It calls itself a development plan, but it isn't. Not in the form, in the draft form in which I've seen it. So Francois, with regard to the question that you are raising, Does this GNU have an economic growth plan? That plan would have been reflected in the medium-term development plan, but it isn't. One of the strange things, or maybe I should say this, about the medium-term development plan is that its drafting was put out to tender. So the highest bidder won the tender and drafted the plan. Yeah. And that tells you something about the GNU. I do not know quite what is going to happen, but as I say, what I've been told is that it's being polished up or whatever to take on board whatever comments came out of the government, Cabinet Lekgotla. So in the end, it will be published. I would urge all of us to have a look at it, to see whether my assessment is right or wrong. I suspect my assessment is right. So essentially, my fear is that we're landed with a situation where, in fact, there will not be a government-approved, actual, realistic economic growth development program. Don't exist. What will mean in terms of the South African economy is not positive. You'll recall, everybody would recall here that in 2020, in fact, even just before COVID-19 hit us, a national consensus developed, which was that the problems in the country are so serious, economic problems I mean, socioeconomic, that they required an agreed joint effort by all of the social partners. Government said that, business said that, the trade union said that, civil society said that. As a result of which, as you would recall, a process started to prepare to draft what was called a social compact, which meant all of us as South Africans would come together and say, what is it that we do together in order to overcome these socio-economic challenges? As part of that process, the government developed an economic recovery and reconstruction plan, which President Ramaphosa, I remember, put to joint sitting of Parliament, I think in October 2020, and said from the point of view of government, this is what needs to happen. The social partners need to get together to achieve the following things. I think that was in October. In July of the same year, the business section, the social partner business, made their own proposal about the same question, what is to be done about the economy, and presented their proposal in July 2020. So we had these two proposals, which were part of this discussion by the social partners. July 2020, business says, let's do this, and government in October says, let's do that. In terms of the broad principles, these two programs don't differ. The importance, for instance, of investment in infrastructure would be emphasized in both documents, and other matters of this kind. There was a meeting, one of the meetings I attended, and I say at the meeting, my view about this process, that process, was when you looked at the government program, it was 32 pages. Dr. Close. When I looked at the government program, sorry, at the business one, it was 132 pages. So I said to the meeting that it seems to me that more work was done by the business people to detail what it is that needed to be done. And so in terms of the negotiations through that NEDLEC process, why don't we take the government plan as a vision? This is where we want to get to. And use the business one to negotiate among ourselves. I remember President Ramaphosa saying at the end of the speech, he said I was correct about the submission of business. That business indeed had made a submission, but I was wrong in one respect, which was that the business plan was not 132 pages, but was 1,000 pages. One of the striking things about the business proposal is that they say, this is what we propose in detail should happen to the South African economy over a 3-year period. At the end of that, we look at what has happened and then do another 3-year program. And they said the program we're proposing over a 3-year period would cost 3.2 trillion rand. 3.2 trillion. And they said, the private sector, we commit ourselves to invest 1 trillion rand over that 3-year period. And the public sector would have to find the other 2.2 trillion. So I said, this is 2020. The very, very first time that the private sector in this country had ever made such a commitment since 1994. It was the very, very first time in 2020 that the private sector would say we commit ourselves to invest in the South African economy. So I was saying that what the government should do is really to put that commitment in the pocket and insist and do whatever is necessary to make sure that it actually happens. That process, as I think everybody knows, disappeared somewhere. It vanished. No social compact. And I think as a country we lost this commitment of this huge investment by the private sector in the economy. I'm raising that, Francois, to say, I think that's where we need to go back to. I think the GNU needs to say, there's that process to try and elaborate a social compact, which for some reason got abandoned somewhere, and yet a lot of preparatory work had been done. Why don't we go back to that in order to give substance to the MTDP, to the Medium-Term Development Plan, substance which does not exist in the current plan? That's where I would go. Because indeed, to discuss this other matter that we're raising, about the budget and VAT and all of that, it's clear that in terms of the state revenues, the fiscal matters, the generation of the revenues that the state needs to impact on development and other things, we are not going to be able to solve this problem in the absence of in the presence of a stagnant economy. Doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter whether we say now, do we raise VAT or do we raise income tax or whatever you want to do. You're going to run into problems in a situation where the economy is stagnant. The additional resources that the state needs must come from a larger economy. Hence, the critical importance of ensuring that we don't have wish lists, which we call development plans, but actual plans. Actual plan which says, in a year's time, we want to be from here to there. And part of what that business plan did, it said, within the next 3 years, if we do the following things, we'll invest $1 trillion, government, you invest the rest, and at the end of the 3 years, we should have created so many new jobs. We will have expanded the money going to the fiscals by so much. Things that are measurable. With commitments that you are business, you are government, you are trade union or whatever, with commitments that can be met. I'm saying that I think that's where we need to go back to that. The medium-term development plan is not going to help us. Now, whether the government of national unity thinks the way I think, I don't know. But I'm saying as a country, we need to get back to a situation where we do actual planning about the economic future. And not depend on visions, which we think will implement themselves. Visions don't. They are necessary, but they don't implement themselves. The government of national unity, of course, has got to sort itself out. The government, I see sometimes that some of the ministers, one of them was debating about a bill that was in Parliament, and he wanted to amend it. I was saying to myself that what he doesn't understand, that particular minister, was that every single bill that comes out of government to Parliament, it comes from the cabinet. It doesn't come from a minister. It might be a minister who goes to present it there, but it's a policy decision of the cabinet. So you can't stand up as a minister and say, no, I want to change it. You can't. But I'm just saying that maybe it's people who are new to government and therefore didn't know quite what to do. The issues that were raised at the beginning about the US, China, AGOA, risks related to China, preference, is it trade or diplomacy, whatever. I think as a country, we must, as a matter of policy, say that we are not looking for enemies. We must conduct a foreign policy which says we want friendly and mutually beneficial cooperation with everybody in the world. And that even if we reach a bilateral agreement with country A, we don't reach that agreement as a way of opposing another country. Yeah. So the idea that you've got to choose this one rather than that one, we can't accept that. I'm saying as a government, as a country, we need to make sure that we try and build good relations with the US, good relations with China, and good relations with everybody. That's how we should come at it. And the notion that you must have better relations with the one with whom you have more trade than the one with whom you don't, I think is wrong. We want good relations. There are problems, of course, as we know now, between the relations between South Africa and the United States currently. Personally, it's a matter that worries me. Because as a country, we don't need enemies. We've got too many problems for us to be nurturing enemies of any kind. As all of us know, President Trump is serving his second term as President of the United States. So as a country, we've actually got experience of our relationship with President Trump from the first term. And for 4 years, during that first term, we actually had very good relations with the Trump administration. The ambassador at the time, those of us who are old enough, like Mbeki UNISA, will remember her. It was Ambassador Lana Marx, a lady. One of the things about her was that she was born in East London and migrated to the United States, was an American citizen. But South Africa remained in her heart. So President Trump chose her as his ambassador to South Africa. And indeed, she came, and I get a message that she'd like to see me, so I saw her before she had presented her credentials. And she says, President, the reason I wanted to see is to introduce myself to you and to say to you that my instructions from the US are that in terms of everything I do here in order to improve relations between the United States and South Africa, I must seek your opinion. So I said to her, but I'm a retiree. She said, it doesn't matter, but that's my instruction. And indeed, we worked very well with her. I'm telling you this story, colleagues, in order to say, therefore, the current relations come as a surprise to me. Because you had a President Trump of that first term, and South Africa had very good relations with that administration. I'm not quite sure what has happened now. In particular, because now if I can put on an older cap. As the ANC, we have a long history of interacting with the Republican Party in the United States. They were very, very much involved, the Republican Party, in the struggle against apartheid. You'd remember that, I think it was in 1986, that the US Congress approved what they called the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which was vetoed by President Reagan, Republican President Reagan, vetoed that act. Now, it is possible, according to the US Constitution, it's possible to override the veto of the president by Congress taking a decision with particular majorities. I think particularly the Senate. And the struggle to override the veto by President Reagan was led by Republican presidents. I even remember the names: Senator Lugar, Senator Nancy, remember her? Castlebaum. Those two Republican senators organized in Senate to Republican senators to override a decision by a Republican president in favor of sanctions against apartheid South Africa. I'm giving that as an example, colleagues, who say that this is part of the history of our relationship with the. Therefore, when you have a situation as we have now, with all these tensions, my view is that we need to have a serious, very serious engagement with President Trump and the administration to discuss and say, what's the problem? Because the problem is new. In terms of the history of our relationship with the Republican Party, which goes over many decades, we've never faced a situation of this kind. What's the problem? We need to sit down and sort this thing out. I'm not talking about this full story about persecution of Afrikaners and all that. More substantial. What's the thing that has happened which results in this tension, which South Africa does not need, between ourselves and the US? I think that's what needs to happen. It is true that in the context of which we might even save AGOA, because indeed, as you said Sandy, there are many of our products into the United States which go in duty-free because of AGOA, which might not get access in those markets if that AGOA is removed, resulting in job losses here, and so we don't want that. So I think we need that very serious engagement with President Trump, with the Republican Party, and bearing in mind that when we talk about President Trump, we talk about somebody who has been elected as President of the United States by a very substantial majority. We don't want to be quarreling with this majority of Americans. Hence the need for us to engage seriously about these things with President Trump and the Republican Party to identify, isolate whatever the problems are. It's very, very easy to explain. It would be very simple to explain to them about this fake story about the persecution of Afrikaners and so on, entirely fake. I think it would be very easy to get rid of that particular story, to show that it's not true. So that we can then get to the more substantive matter. There must be something more substantive which results in this kind of friction. Our moderator pointed to a number of ambassadors who are in the room here, who might talk about being an ambassador more authoritatively than I can. As I'm sure all of us know, this is a very important post, a very important position. An ambassador is a representative of the head of state to another head of state. That's what an ambassador does. They are so important, these people, that sometimes they carry the title extraordinary and plenipotentiary. So you can see that Ambassador Ndlozi, extraordinary and plenipotentiary. That expression means, here is Ambassador Ndlozi, appointed as our representative in Zimbabwe. as the ambassador to Zimbabwe. As he interacts with the president of Zimbabwe, an issue arises of importance in terms of the relations between the two countries, which requires a policy decision. And the policy isn't there. But the matter of ensuring that we have got these good relations is critically important. Because this ambassador is extraordinary and plenipotentiary, they are allowed actually to take what is a policy position, to commit a whole country to a policy which is created by this ambassador in order to sort out the relations between these two countries. I'm talking about the importance of the post of ambassador. Part of the process of the appointment of an ambassador is President Mbeki says Mbeki should go to Zimbabwe as our ambassador. That's a request to the President of Zimbabwe to say to the President of Zimbabwe, I propose to send to you Mbeki. Will you accept him? And the President of Zimbabwe is perfectly entitled to say no. And the reason for that might very well be because the Zimbabwe embassy here in Pretoria, when they are asked by Harare, who is Njozi? They report he's a thief. As a consequence of which the ambassador in Zimbabwe, the president in Zimbabwe, will say, no, but how do I talk to a thief? So the appointment is rejected. I'm talking about the importance of this. The ambassador that gets posted is by agreement with the host country. With the host country having made their own assessment that this person of such caliber and quality, that indeed this is a person that the head of state can engage. Because you are an envoy to the head of state. Now, you can therefore understand that as such an envoy, you can't go around expressing negative opinions about your host. The diplomatic dean here of our diplomatic corps is here. He knows this very well. You can't you get Ambassador Ndlozi, who's an ambassador to South Africa. I'm president. He can't make speeches to say, that one doesn't wash. He's smelly. He can't do that. It may be correct. But he can't say that. Because it means from then onwards, there is no way I can talk to him. He ceases to be an ambassador that is respected by this host. So I'm saying that the post of ambassador has got particular restrictions. There's even conventions, the Vienna Convention, which govern the behavior of diplomats. Ibrahim Rasool is an old friend and comrade of mine. But I think in this instance he made a mistake. He said things about his host president, which he should not have said. When I saw this and I saw this persona non grata, I wasn't surprised. Because it means practically you make an assessment of your host president, which is negative. And you want to sit with that president tomorrow. They won't agree. This is your view of me. Now you want to come and sit and talk serious matters with me? No. I was very glad when he landed in Cape Town, Ibrahim, when he's talking to people, that he was insisting that whatever might have happened in his case, it was critically important that South Africa must understand that it needs good relations with the United States. It was correct. So his proficiency as a diplomat, and fortunately our school here, run by Department of International Relations, prepares these appointees. For months you sit there and you get prepared how to be a good diplomat. So that even if you are a political appointee, that particular process of proficiency is a matter that is dealt with. It ought not, this particular incident, it should not serve as an obstacle to any process that we need towards restoring good relations with the United States. I think I'm quite sure that Ibrahim Rasool himself would recognize this, that as a diplomat, you don't represent yourself. You can't say this is my personal opinion. I'm speaking in my private capacity. There's no private capacity. Agenda 2063, you know that it's being implemented in terms of decades. The first decade of Agenda 2063 was 2014 to 2023. That's been done. There's a report that has been prepared as to whether it has achieved the targets that it has set at the beginning of that decade. It's a continental program. That particular report, as far as I can tell, doesn't actually go into detail to say the member states of the African Union contributed to these outcomes of 23 in the following ways. It doesn't. Maybe it can't be done like that. But I think we must bear in mind, in this context, the various elements that impact on this issue of the African economic development. One of them is this approach that the regional economic communities are important building blocks in terms of what we need to do with regard to African integration, African unity, and all of that. So I think that would be my starting point, to say with regard to Agenda 2063, during this first decade, what is it that our region contributed to the success of that first decade? Within which you can then ask the question, what did South Africa specifically do in that context? Unfortunately, part of what has happened in our country for some years now is that over a number of years, we have dismantled our Africa policy. The focus that historically, that as a democratic South Africa, the focus that we had on the African continent receded over the years. Yeah. And therefore, I think that as part of addressing this question, what did we do with regard to Agenda 2063, we must look at this question, how do we come back to have a real, genuine policy, an Africa policy, which drives our activities? We must go back to that. It relates to a larger question. Perhaps it relates to a question that was raised by Katlego with regard to the peace and security matter. have we as Africans, as the African Union, assessed our own shortcomings with regard to that? I'm saying this question I was raising now about our contribution to 2063 and the role and Africa policy. I think you can see this, that part of what has happened, for whatever reason, the quality of political leadership on the continent has declined. And that has included a reduction in the intensity of this feeling of a Pan-African feeling. And you see its impact practically. For instance, if you take the decisions taken by the UN Security Council in 2011 about Libya, the African Union had taken certain positions about how to handle Libya, including no military interventions, and sent the resolution to the Security Council. A week later, Security Council went directly against that AU position. And as you know what happened there, NATO invaded, Gaddafi was killed, the Libyan state was destroyed. Directly contrary to what the African leadership had said. To this day, the problems of Libya are still unresolved. Africa appoints a special envoy to join these others in trying to sort out the problems in Libya. I'm talking about a specific person whose name I shall not mention, who actually abandoned that job. He walked away. And the reason he walked away was because you have all of these people who are active, from the United Nations, from the Arab League, and they would hold meetings without him. He was just an addendum there that is forgotten. Yeah. So in the end, he left. He abandoned that job. Yeah. But it was a statement about, I'm saying that where you have a situation where an African, a very, very important African view is ignored about an African country. And the rest of the world acts about this African country without regard to whatever these Africans are saying. It tells you something about what has happened in terms of the standing of the African continent internationally and the standing of its leadership. I think there has been a movement backwards with regard to that. It's also reflected here in this country, among ourselves. So when I'm talking about a movement backwards away from Pan-Africanism, that engagement in the continent, I'm talking also about ourselves. It's something that we need to address, which would help us in terms of measuring what kind of impact do we have as a country with regard to programs like Agenda 2063. I am not aware of any particular engagement in terms of the African Union to deal with its shortcomings with regard to issues of peace and security. That kind of assessment, I don't know if it has been. Maybe it has. But it's again very visible. You have a war that breaks out in Ethiopia between the central government, federal government, Addis Ababa, against one of the states, Tigray. 2020, Domran, Anyway, breaks out. I happen to chair the African Union Subcommittee on the Horn of Africa. So we then decided as that committee to talk to the African Peace and Security Council, to say to them, as this panel on the Horn of Africa, we can't move forward until this conflict among the Ethiopians is resolved. So please, PSC, Peace and Security Council, do your job as mandated by the Constitutive Act of the African Union, the African Peace and Security Architecture. Do what you have to do to solve this thing, and then as a panel on the Horn, we'll be able to do our work. The then current chair of the Peace and Security Council replied to me after he had finished his term as the chair. And he says to me, thank you very much for your report. And then the important question that you raise. Please raise that question with my successor. And the reality of the matter is that the African Union Peace and Security Council would not discharge its responsibilities with regard to working to end that conflict in Ethiopia. They walked away from it. Until very late in a particular way, when President Obasanjo was appointed as the envoy of the chair of the commission, not even a chair of the PSC, it's the chair of the commission, the envoy of the commission, of the chair of the commission. But I'm saying effectively the Peace and Security Council had walked away from its responsibilities to deal with the conflict in Ethiopia. You have the conflict currently taking place in Sudan. There is a subcommittee of the African Union which was appointed to deal with the Sudanese issue. It's led by a very good African, very good person. But the Sudanese are not listening. So there is actually no engagement of the African Union with the conflict in Sudan. Or you have the situation in the Sahel, where now you have this alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, that have broken away from ECOWAS because of the way the ECOWAS responded after there was a coup in Niger. They've worked out. That regional economic community, ECOWAS, of course, is weaker by that fact. It's a matter of concern, must be a matter of concern to the African Union. But it's nowhere to be seen. Or you get the conflict in Somalia. The latest report I received about that, I have no way of verifying it, but I believe the reporters. They say Al-Shabaab, instead of getting weakened, is actually getting stronger. Coming very close to Mogadishu. The African Union, in my view, ought to be sitting and saying, an intervention force was established, and it's been there, so Uganda and all that. What's happening? It suggests to me that we've got to come back to the point of saying there has to be a political solution with regard to the conflict in Somalia, not a military one. I don't know where the AU is with regard to that. Or take the matter of this conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think I've said this before in one of our meetings here, that conflict in the DRC is a domestic Congolese conflict. There's a view that is taken hold among some people that is a conflict which impacts on the sovereignty of the Congo. And therefore there's some outside force. When you talk about peace in the DRC, about ending this intervention by some outside force. No. The conflict in the Congo is fundamentally a conflict among the Congolese people. And derives from the fact that there's a section of the population of the Congo in the eastern Congo, which the government in Kinshasa does not want to recognize as Congolese. This is a Rwanda-speaking population. During Mobutu's years, Mobutu said, these are not Congolese, drive them back to Rwanda. You even had a militia formed in the eastern Congo, one called, for instance, Mai Mai. Those years. Not Mai Mai in Kombot, but Mai Mai. With a specific task to drive out these Congolese-speaking Rwandans, these Rwandan-speaking Congolese, to drive them out into the Congo, into Rwanda. And that's why the M23 gets formed. Because the Rwandan-speaking Congolese say the government is not protecting us, we must protect ourselves. I don't know where the particular conflict is going to end, but again, what I hear from the Congolese is that in reality, today, 70% of the population of the Congo supports the M23. Because they are saying the country as a whole, for some reason, has developed a hostile attitude towards the government in Kinshasa. So what we might very well see is this rebellion among the Congolese against their own government. Again, I'm trying to answer the question, where was the AU? I don't know where it was. So there are those shortcomings. And I hope that with the election now of a new commission of the Peace and Security Council, which was done a few days ago, that indeed the reconstitution of the Commission of the African Union would create the possibility to have a relook at these matters, to have the assessment that you are talking about, to identify the shortcomings and decide what is to be done. I agree with you that in terms of the G20 and our chairing of the G20, it will be important to put on the agenda of the G20 the matter of this, the debt trap to which you referred. Because indeed it is a serious problem. Okay. It is a serious problem that needs to be addressed, including this matter about the reform of the financial architecture. That's an important issue of the World Bank, of the Bretton Woods institutions. That's an important matter. It needs to be put on the agenda of the G20, in addition to the debt trap issue, so that indeed, if a common position can be elaborated coming out of the G20 with regard to that financial architecture, it would be important. And I would add to that an important matter for us as Africans, in addition to the issue of the financial architecture, which is the issue of the loss of huge volumes of resources through illicit financial outflows. That is an important matter that needs to be addressed by the G20. Because when these resources flow out of the continent as illicit outflows, they end up somewhere. And in many instances, they end up being hosted by some of the countries who are part of the G20. So to take a G20 common position to say, what do we do to combat this very negative phenomenon of these illicit financial flows, which impact very badly on the developing countries, not only Africa, which must include the issue of the elimination of the tax havens.